high above the world, where the oxygen grows thin and the air carries the scent of damp moss and ancient stone, there is a kingdom perpetually draped in white. It is a place where the trees are twisted like the limbs of tired giants, their branches heavy with bromeliads and orchids that bloom in shadows. Here, the eastern slopes of the Peruvian Andes fall away into the emerald depths of the Amazon basin, creating a realm of vertical forests and endless mist, a place the locals call the eyebrows of the jungle. It is a landscape that feels as though it belongs to a dream, or perhaps a memory that the earth has tried to wash away with centuries of falling rain. As the fog rolls through the canyons, it clings to the sheer limestone cliffs, revealing and then swallowing the ruins of a civilization that seems to defy the very laws of the mountain. These are the lands of the Chachapoya, the people of the clouds, who built their homes where the earth meets the sky and lived in a silence broken only by the wind. In the year 1553, a Spanish chronicler named Pedro Chiesa de Leon traveled through these rugged highlands, recording what he saw with a mixture of bewilderment and profound respect. He was a man used to the sun-drenched valleys of the Incas and the coastal deserts, yet here he found something entirely different. He wrote of a people who did not look like any other group in the New World, describing them as the whitest and most handsome of all the people he had encountered in the Indies. Their skin, he noted, was pale, and their features possessed a refinement that startled the European explorers. Chiesa de Leon observed that their women were especially beautiful, possessing a grace that led the Incan royalty to seek them out as wives and priestesses. He called them the Warriors of the Clouds, a title that has echoed through the centuries, carrying with it the weight of a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. As you settle into your blankets and find a comfortable position for the night, you are in the right place to let the mysteries of the past wash over you. Here at the Slumber Archives, we bring you new journeys into history every single day, crafted specifically to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. If you find yourself enjoying this quiet exploration of the ancient world, please consider subscribing so you never miss a night of storytelling, and perhaps leave a like as it helps other weary travelers find their way to our fireside. Now, let us return to the high, misty peaks of the Andes, where the secrets of a lost people still wait in the shadows. The Chachapoya were not a single empire in the way we think of the Romans or even the Incas, but rather a loose confederation of independent groups bound together by a shared culture and a mastery of the most inhospitable terrain imaginable. They flourished from the 8th century until the time of the Spanish Conquest, carving massive stone citadels into the sides of mountains that seem impossible to scale even with modern equipment. Their architecture was distinct, characterized by circular stone houses decorated with intricate geometric friezes, patterns of diamonds and zigzagging lines that some believe represent the eyes of the jaguar or the scales of the serpent. These structures were built upon massive platforms, some rising 60 feet into the air, creating a skyline of stone towers that peered out over the canopy of the cloud forest. Unlike the smooth interlocking masonry of the Incas, the Chachapoya style was rugged and textured, reflecting the wild and untamed nature of the mountains they called home. But it was not just their buildings that captured the imagination of history. It was the people themselves. The descriptions provided by the early Spanish explorers have led to centuries of speculation and debate among archaeologists and historians. How could a group of people with light skin and fair hair exist in the heart of the South American highlands, thousands of miles from the shores of Europe or the Mediterranean? Some have looked toward the sea, wondering if ancient voyagers from distant lands somehow found their way across the Atlantic, while others look to the complex genetics of the Amazonian tribes. Mainstream science often leans toward the idea of a localized genetic mutation, or perhaps a unique adaptation to the low-light environment of the perpetually cloudy forests. Yet the questions persist, hanging in the air like the very mist that surrounds their ruins. The Chachapoya were fierce defenders of their sovereignty, For centuries, they resisted the expansion of the Inca Empire, fighting with a tenacity that earned them their reputation as elite warriors. The Incas, who were masters of the Andes, found the Chachapoya to be their most difficult conquest. It was only in the late 15th century, under the rule of the Inca Tupac Yupanqui, that the Cloud people were finally brought into the fold. And even then, they remained a rebellious and proud population. They were a people who lived on the edge of the world, and they fought as if they were a part of the mountain itself. And then, as if by some cruel trick of fate, they vanished. Shortly after the arrival of the Spanish, the Chachapoya population plummeted, decimated by European diseases like smallpox, to which they had no immunity. Within a few generations, their cities were abandoned to the encroaching jungle, their language was silenced, and their history was relegated to the realm of myth. To understand the Chachapoya, one must look at the deep time of the Andes, a landscape that has been inhabited for thousands of years by cultures that rose and fell long before the first stone was laid at Machu Picchu. When we speak of archaeology, we often talk about stratigraphy, which is simply the study of the layers of earth that accumulate over centuries, with the oldest secrets buried deepest at the bottom. In the case of the cloud forest, these layers are difficult to read. The high humidity and constant rainfall are the enemies of preservation, rotting wood and cloth and bone, with a quiet, relentless hunger. Yet, in the most inaccessible places, on the faces of vertical cliffs and inside the hollows of high caves, the Chachapoya left behind their dead in a way that has allowed them to speak across the ages. They practiced a unique form of mummification, placing their ancestors in clay sarcophagi that resemble giant stylized human figures. These statues, known as purun makus, stand on narrow ledges overlooking vast valleys, their sightless eyes forever watching the horizon. They were painted in shades of ochre and white, topped with feathered headdresses or even human skulls. To the Chachapoya, the dead were not gone. They were the guardians of the living, situated in the transition zone between the earth and the heavens. The presence of these mummies, preserved by the cool, dry air of the caves, provides a haunting link to a population that was almost entirely erased. As we look closer at the evidence, we find ourselves grappling with the limits of what we can truly know about the past. Radiocarbon dating, a method that measures the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic material, tells us that the Chachapoya were established in these mountains by at least the year 800. But where did they come from before that? Some researchers point to the period of the Younger Dryas, a brief cold snap in the Earth's climate that occurred over 10,000 years ago, suggesting that shifting weather patterns have always driven humans to seek refuge in the microclimates of the Andes. Perhaps the Chachapoya were the descendants of a much older group that migrated from the Amazonian lowlands, seeking the safety and cool air of the high altitudes. Or perhaps they were a remnant of an even more ancient migration, one that has been lost to the fog of time. The mystery of the Chachapoya is not merely a question of where they came from, but how they managed to thrive in a place that seems so resistant to human life. They engineered sophisticated drainage systems to prevent their cities from sliding off the mountain slopes during the heavy rains. They cultivated crops on narrow terraces, growing potatoes and maize in the thin soil. They were masters of the vertical world, moving with ease between different ecological zones, from the humid jungle floor to the high grassy plains known as the Jalka. Their existence was a testament to human ingenuity and the ability to find beauty and order in the most chaotic of environments. Meanwhile, the silence of the ruins continues to beckon. Today, the great citadel of Kuelap stands as a silent sentinel, a massive walled city with over 400 circular buildings perched on a ridge 3,000 meters above sea level. Its walls rise 60 feet high, constructed from hundreds of thousands of tons of limestone. It is often called the Machu Picchu of the north yet it is older and in many ways more mysterious than its famous southern cousin. As the wind whistles through the empty doorways of Kuelap, one cannot help but feel the presence of the thousands who once lived, laughed, and died within these walls. They were a people of the wind and the water, a civilization that rose like the morning mist and vanished just as quietly when the sun of a new era rose over the horizon. And so, we begin our journey into the heart of the cloud forest, a journey through forgotten cities and hidden tombs, seeking the truth behind the legends of the blue-eyed kings. The story of the Chachapoya is a reminder that history is not a straight line but a tapestry of many threads, some of which are cut short, leaving us to wonder about the patterns that might have been. As we move deeper into the night, let the image of the mist-covered mountains fill your mind, and listen for the echoes of the warriors of the clouds, whose secrets are still held fast by the ancient stone and the eternal green of the Andes. Imagine a single drop of rain falling upon the eastern slopes of the Andes, where the granite peaks first begin their long, tumbling descent toward the Amazon basin. This water does not flow into a gentle valley, but instead joins a chaotic race through a landscape that seems to defy the very laws of geometry. Here, wedged between the deep, churning trenches of the Marañón and Huállaga rivers, lies a vertical kingdom that the modern world is only just beginning to map in its entirety. It is a world of extremes, where the earth is tilted at impossible angles, and where the distance between 2 points is never measured in miles, but in the grueling hours of a climb or the precarious descent into a canyon floor that rarely sees the direct light of the noon sun. This is the ancestral home of the Chachapoya, a land defined by its sheer, unforgiving verticality. To understand these people, one must first understand the ceja de selva, a poetic Spanish phrase meaning the eyebrow of the jungle. It is a narrow, transitional ribbon of life, where the frigid, thin air of the high mountains meets the humid, heavy breath of the rainforest. In this ecological crossroads, the environment is perpetually draped in a thick silver veil of mist. It is a realm of damp mosses, of orchids that cling to gnarled branches, and of trees that seem to groan under the weight of the epiphytes that call them home. The Chachapoya did not merely inhabit this space, they mastered it, weaving their civilization into the very fabric of the cliffs and ridges. While other Andean cultures look to the wide, flat plateaus or the coastal valleys to build their empires, the warriors of the clouds chose the edges of the world, building their homes where the earth meets the sky in a jagged, broken line. As the centuries drifted by, this rugged terrain became their greatest protector and their most demanding teacher. The isolation provided by the Marañón and Huállaga rivers acted as a natural moat, deeper and more formidable than any man-made fortification. These rivers are not calm waterways. They are roaring torrents that have carved deep, impassable gorges into the bedrock over millions of years. To cross from one ridge to the next was a journey of days, requiring a physical resilience that shaped the very biology of the people who lived there. This geographic seclusion allowed the Chachapoya to develop a culture that was strikingly distinct from the better-known civilizations of the central Andes. While the Inca were beginning to dream of a unified empire connected by stone roads, the Chachapoya remained a collection of independent chiefdoms, bound together not by a single king, but by a shared language, a shared aesthetic, and a shared reverence for the high places. Life in the eyebrow of the jungle required a specialized form of survival. The Chachapoya became masters of high-altitude ridge farming, carving narrow terraces into the slopes that seem, to the modern eye, almost too steep to stand upon. They utilized the different ecological niches provided by the vertical landscape, planting hardy tubers like potatoes and ochre in the higher, colder reaches, while descending into the warmer pockets of the valleys to gather coca leaves and tropical fruits. This vertical archipelago of resources meant that a single community could access a vast variety of foods simply by moving up or down the mountain, rather than traveling great distances across the land. It was a life lived on a ladder, a constant movement between the clouds and the canopy. But it was on the highest ridges, the narrow spines of the mountains, where the Chachapoya truly left their mark. Here, they built their massive stone citadels and their circular homes, often perched on the very brink of 1,000-foot drops. These locations were chosen with a strategic brilliance that suggests a people who were deeply concerned with defense. From these heights, a sentry could look out across the sea of mist and sea for miles, watching for the movement of rival groups or the eventual approach of the expanding Inca state. The wind at these altitudes is a constant companion, a low, whistling sound that carries the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. When you stand among the ruins today, the silence is heavy, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk or the distant rush of a waterfall hidden deep in the green folds of the mountain. This isolation was not just a matter of physical safety. It was the crucible in which their unique identity was forged. In the deep time of the Andes, where cultures have risen and fallen like the tides for millennia, the Chachapoya remained a mystery even to their neighbors. Their architecture, characterized by massive circular towers decorated with intricate stone friezes of serpents and feline eyes, bore little resemblance to the precise, rectangular stonework of the south. Their burial customs, too, were unique. They placed their dead in elaborate sarcophagi, or high-perched tombs called chulpas, tucked into the hollows of cliffs where no predator and few humans could ever reach them. It was as if they wanted their ancestors to keep a permanent watch over the living, their stone eyes forever fixed on the horizon. As we consider the sheer difficulty of building such a civilization, we must grapple with the limits of our own understanding. How did they move the massive limestone blocks to the tops of these ridges without the use of the wheel or large draft animals? How did they maintain such a vibrant agricultural system in a place where the soil is constantly being washed away by the relentless rains? The answers are buried beneath layers of leaf litter and centuries of forest growth. Archaeology here is a slow, painstaking process. Using techniques like radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic materials, and stratigraphy, the study of soil layers to establish a timeline of human occupation, researchers are slowly piecing together a chronology. They have found evidence that the Chachapoya heartland was inhabited as early as the 9th century, long before the Inca ever turned their gaze toward the north. The more we learn, the more the landscape itself seems to be a character in their story. The mountains were not just a place to live, they were sacred beings, apus, that demanded respect and offerings. The Chachapoya saw the world in 3 tiers, the heavens above, the world of the living, and the dark, watery underworld below. In the vertical realm of the Andes, these tiers were not abstract concepts, but physical realities that one could see and touch. The peaks were the gateway to the stars, while the deep caves and sinkholes that pepper the limestone terrain were the entrances to the realm of the ancestors. This connection to the earth was so profound that even their buildings seemed to grow out of the rock, blurring the line between the natural and the man-made. And so, the Chachapoya lived for hundreds of years in a state of precarious balance, a civilization suspended between the earth and the sky. They were a people of the mist, defined by the very barriers that kept the rest of the world at bay. But isolation is a fragile shield. As the 15th century approached, the winds began to change, bringing with them the sounds of a new power rising in the south. The Inca, the children of the sun, were turning their eyes toward the northern forests, drawn by the lure of exotic feathers, medicinal plants, and the fierce reputation of the cloud people. The vertical realm, once an impenetrable fortress, was about to become a battlefield. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the quiet of those high ridges before the coming of the storm. Picture the silver light of the moon reflecting off the damp stone of a circular house and the warmth of a small fire flickering within. Outside, the great green expanse of the Andes stretches out in every direction, a labyrinth of peaks and valleys that has kept its secrets for 1,000 years. The Chachapoya are there, resting in the silence of their mountain home, unaware that their story is about to be woven into a much larger and darker tapestry. For now, there is only the sound of the wind through the orchids and the slow, steady heartbeat of the ancient earth. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a heavy chisel striking limestone, a rhythmic clinking that echoed across the peaks long before the first Spanish boot touched this soil. This is the sound of Kuelap beginning to breathe. To understand the Chachapoya, one must look upward, to the very crown of a mountain ridge 6,000 feet above the Utcubamba Valley, where a fortress of such staggering proportions sits shrouded in the drifting mists of the cloud forest. It is not merely a city. It is a statement carved into the sky, a testament to a people who refuse to live in the shadows of the valleys below. As we approach the massive outer walls, the sheer scale of the labor involved begins to weigh upon the mind. These walls rise up to 60 feet in height, a vertical sea of hand-cut limestone blocks that wrap around the plateau for nearly 2,000 feet. It is often said that Kuelap is the Machu Picchu of the north, yet such a comparison almost does a disservice to the antiquity of this place. While the Inca jewel was built at the height of their short-lived empire, Kuelap was already ancient when the first Inca kings were born. Archaeologists, using radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to pinpoint the age of organic remains, have found that construction here began as early as the 6th century. For nearly 1,000 years, the Chachapoya added stone upon stone, creating a structure that contains 3 times more volume of masonry than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is a staggering thought that such a monumental feat was achieved by a culture whose name is barely whispered in the annals of history. The entrance to this mountain citadel is a masterpiece of psychological engineering. Rather than wide, welcoming gates, the Chachapoya constructed narrow, high-walled corridors that taper as they ascend. At the top, the passage becomes so thin that only one person can pass through at a time. It is a design born of necessity and perhaps a deep-seated caution, ensuring that any unwanted guest would find themselves trapped in a funnel of stone, vulnerable to those watching from the ramparts above. Once inside, the landscape shifts from a fortress to a living, breathing community. Within these walls, more than 400 circular dwellings are scattered across the terraces, their foundations like stone rings left by some titan's hand. These were not the square, rigid structures of the coastal peoples, but soft, rounded homes that mirrored the curves of the mountains themselves. The thatched roofs are long gone, reclaimed by the damp air and the hungry vines, but the stone walls remain, often decorated with intricate friezes of zigzags and diamond patterns. These geometric carvings are thought to represent the eyes of the jaguar or the scales of the serpent, sacred symbols that watched over the families as they slept. Walking through the ruins, one can almost sense the layers of social stratification that defined life in the clouds. The city is divided into lower and upper districts, with the more elaborate houses situated on the higher ground, reserved perhaps for the elite, the shamans, or the warrior kings who led the people of the clouds. In these larger homes, archaeologists have uncovered grinding stones, ceramic vessels for corn beer, and hearths that still hold the faint, dark stains of ancient fires. It is a domestic quietude that stands in stark contrast to the martial strength of the outer walls. Here, children played with clay figurines, women wove intricate textiles from alpaca wool, and the elders looked out over the dizzying drop of the cliffs, watching the weather patterns shift across the horizon. At the southern end of the complex stands a structure that defies easy explanation, a building known today as El Tintero, or the Inkwell. It is an inverted cone, wider at the top than at the base, plunging down into the earth like a stone funnel. For decades, researchers have debated its purpose. Was it a solar observatory, designed to track the movements of the sun and stars through the thin mountain air? Or was it something more somber? A place of ritual sacrifice where the blood of the earth was honored. Deep within its center, bones of deer and other sacred animals have been found, suggesting that El Tintero was the spiritual heart of Kuelap, a bridge between the world of the living and the dark mysteries of the underworld. It is here, in the presence of such enigmatic architecture, that we must confront the limits of our understanding. We see the stones, we measure the walls, and we map the dwellings, yet the inner lives of the Chachapoya remain a closed book. They lived in a world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was as thin as the mountain mist. To them, Kuelap was not just a defensive stronghold, it was a sacred mountain made of stone, a place where they could be closer to the celestial powers that governed the rain and the harvests. As the wind whistles through the narrow passages of the entrance, it carries with it the weight of centuries. The engineering required to transport these millions of cubic feet of stone up the steep slopes, without the use of the wheel or beasts of burden like the horse or ox, speaks to a social organization of incredible complexity. It suggests a society that was not just a collection of warring tribes, but a unified culture capable of a singular, multi-generational vision. And yet, for all its strength, Kuelap feels haunted. There is a lingering silence in the way the moss creeps over the limestone, a sense that the city is waiting for voices that will never return. As we look across the terraces, we see evidence of daily life that feels strangely familiar. Small niches in the walls served as shelving. Drainage channels carved into the rock kept the torrential rains from flooding the homes. There is a profound intelligence in the layout, a harmony with the rugged terrain that modern builders often struggle to achieve. But beneath this harmony lies the mystery of their identity. Who were these people who built such a massive sanctuary so far from the reach of other civilizations? Why did they choose the most inaccessible peaks? And what were they so afraid of that they felt the need to encircle their lives in 60 feet of solid rock? The mystery deepens when we consider the sheer duration of their stay. Stratigraphy, the study of soil layers to determine the passage of time, shows us that generation after generation lived within these walls, repairing the stones, burying their dead beneath the floors of their houses, and watching the seasons turn. They saw empires rise and fall in the distant valleys, yet they remained here, suspended between the earth and the heavens. The limestone of Kuelap has absorbed 1,000 years of human experience, the cries of newborns, the songs of the harvest, and the quiet prayers of the dying. And so, we linger in the shadows of the high walls, letting the cool air of the Andes settle around us. The scale of Kuelap is a reminder of how much of our human story is written in stone, yet how easily the meaning of those stones can be lost to the passage of deep time. The Chachapoya left no written records, no scrolls or tablets to explain their origins or their end. They left only this: a silent, grey giant perched upon a cliff, a fortress of memories that refuses to yield its secrets to the modern world. As the light fades over the limestone ramparts, we are left to wonder if we are even asking the right questions, or if the true story of Kuelap is something that can only be felt in the stillness of the mountain air. High above the valley floor, where the mist clings to the rock like a damp shroud, there is a sound that persists even when the wind dies down. It is the sound of water dripping from the limestone overhangs, a slow rhythmic ticking that marks the passage of centuries in this vertical world. If you were to look up from the banks of the Utcubamba River, your eyes would likely skip over the shadows and the jagged crevices, seeing only stone. But as the fog thins, a row of figures emerges from the cliff face, standing in a line as if waiting for a procession, that was forgotten 1,000 years ago. These are the sarcophagi of Karaja, 6 towering anthropomorphic figures perched on a ledge so narrow and so high that they seem to defy the very laws of gravity. They are the Purun Machu, the old ancestors, and they have stood here, unblinking and undisturbed, since the middle of the 15th century. The discovery of Karaja in 1985 by the archaeologist Federico Kaufmann Doig was not a discovery of something hidden, but rather a realization of something that had been hiding in plain sight for generations. The local people knew of them, of course, referring to them as the ancient wise men, but to the outside world they represented a profound mystery of funerary architecture. Each figure stands over 2 meters tall, a hollow shell of clay, sticks, and grass molded around a central core. They are not merely statues, they are vessels. Within each of these clay bodies lies the mummified remains of a high-ranking individual, curled into a fetal position and wrapped in fine textiles, encased forever within the belly of a god. The Chachapoya did not bury their honored dead in the earth, where the damp soil would claim them. Instead, they lifted them toward the sky, into the realm of the birds and the clouds, ensuring that even in death, the elite could look down upon the lands they once ruled. The construction of these monuments is a feat of engineering that leaves modern observers in a state of quiet bewilderment. The ledge at Karagia is located several hundred feet above the valley floor, set into a sheer limestone wall with no visible path or means of access. There are no stairs carved into the rock, no remnants of scaffolding, and no easy way to reach the site without modern climbing gear. One must wonder how the ancient builders transported hundreds of pounds of wet clay, wooden supports, and the bodies of their kings up these vertical precipices. Perhaps they lowered themselves from the top of the plateau on ropes made of llama wool and vegetal fibers. Or perhaps the topography of the cliff has changed so drastically over the last 5 centuries that the paths they once used have simply crumbled away into the abyss. There is a certain humility in acknowledging that we do not know how they did it. We can analyze the stratigraphy of the site, the study of the layers of rock and debris, but the physical act of the labor remains a ghost in the machine of history. The aesthetic of the Purun Machu is unlike anything else found in the Andes. Their heads are oversized and bulbous, tapering down to narrow chins, giving them an almost extraterrestrial appearance. They possess prominent, hooked noses and heavy brows, and many are topped with what appear to be human skulls, serving as macabre crowns that emphasize their status as masters of the afterlife. The faces are painted with a stark white pigment derived from local minerals, while their bodies are decorated with geometric patterns in deep, earthy reds. These colors were not chosen at random. In the symbolic language of the Chachapoya, red and white were the colors of transition, white representing the bone and the spirit, and red representing the blood and the living earth. By painting these sentinels in such contrasting hues, the builders were marking the boundary between the world of the light and the world of the shadows. As you watch them, through the lens of a telescope or the steady eye of a drone, you notice the fine details that have survived the relentless mountain rains. Some of the figures wear necklaces carved from wood, while others have distinct facial markings that may represent the tattoos or ritual scarification worn by the Chachapoya nobility. They stand shoulder to shoulder, their forms merging into a single unified wall of ancestors. There is a profound sense of intentionality in their placement. They are positioned to face the rising sun, their hollow eyes catching the first rays of light as it breaks over the eastern ridges. It is a silent dialogue between the stone and the star, a ritual that has repeated itself every morning for over 500 years, even as the civilization that created them vanished into the folds of the Spanish conquest. The use of radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic material, has placed the creation of the Karagia sarcophagi in the years leading up to the Inca expansion. This was a time of great tension, a period when the Chachapoya were fortifying their mountain homes against the encroaching empire from the south. The sarcophagi of Karagia may have been more than just tombs. They may have been psychological markers, territorial claims carved into the very bones of the earth. They told all who looked up from the valley that this land belonged to the ancestors, and that those ancestors were still watching, still guarding the mountain passes. It is a form of immortality that relies not on the preservation of the name, but on the permanence of the image. We do not know the names of the men inside these clay shells, but we know their presence. There is a strange, heavy stillness that descends when one contemplates the sheer isolation of these figures. They have seen the rise and fall of empires, the changing of the climate, and the slow encroachment of the jungle vines. They have survived earthquakes that sent massive boulders crashing into the river below, yet they remain anchored to their narrow shelf, protected by the overhang of the cliff. It is as if the mountain itself has decided to cradle them, shielding them from the erosion of time. The Chachapoya understood the geology of their home with an intimacy we can only imagine. They knew which veins of limestone were stable and which were prone to collapse. They knew how the wind swirled through the canyons and where the rain would fall hardest. They chose this spot not just for its height, but for its sanctuary. In the silence of the high Andes, it is easy to succumb to the feeling that these figures are not made of clay and wood at all, but are instead something organic that grew from the rock. They are the bridge between the human and the mineral, a testament to a culture that saw no division between the natural world and the supernatural realm. As the mist rolls back in, swallowing the white faces of the Purun Machu once again, we are reminded of the limits of our vision. We see the statues, we measure the clay, and we date the wood. But the spirit that drove a people to suspend their kings in the air remains just out of reach, a secret kept by the Cliffside Sentinels. The Chachapoya may have been conquered by the Inca and later decimated by the diseases of the Old World, but here, in the vertical reaches of Karagia, they are still the undisputed masters of the heights, watching, waiting, and enduring as the world below continues its restless turning. The mystery of the blue-eyed kings is often whispered in the same breath as these statues, fueled by early Spanish accounts of a people who were taller and fairer than their neighbors. While the clay faces of Karagia do not give us the color of their eyes, they do give us a sense of their dignity. The elongated heads and the proud set of the jaw suggest a people who viewed themselves as apart from the world, a civilization of the clouds that looked down upon the humid forests and the dry plateaus with the detached gaze of the eagle. As we move deeper into the heart of their territory, away from the sheer cliffs and toward the hidden valleys where their cities lie buried in green, the scale of their ambition only grows. The Sentinels of Karagia are but the gatekeepers to a much larger story, one that is written in stone and bone across the entire length of the Utcubamba. The sound of water lapping against a dark, silent shore is perhaps the oldest sound in the world, a rhythmic pulse that has echoed through the Andes since the glaciers first retreated thousands of years ago. High above the roaring Marañón, tucked into a fold of the mountains that seems to defy the very laws of geography, lies the Laguna de los Condores, the lake of the Condors. For centuries, this black, still water was known only to the birds of prey that circled its limestone cliffs, and the occasional hunter who dared to tread upon its moss-slicked banks. It is a place where the air feels heavy with the dampness of the jungle and the cold of the peaks, a liminal space where the living and the dead have shared a long, quiet vigil. In the year 1996, this silence was broken. A group of local workers, searching for treasures that the legends promised were hidden in the clouds, looked up at a sheer cliff face overlooking the lake. There, nestled into a natural ledge hundreds of feet above the water, they saw the glint of painted wood and the unmistakable outlines of ancient masonry. What they stumbled upon was not merely a tomb, but a library of the flesh, a massive funerary complex that had remained untouched by the outside world for over 5 centuries. As the news of the discovery trickled down from the heights to the halls of academia, the world began to realize that the Chachapoya had left us a gift of unimaginable clarity. When archaeologists finally reached the site, they found more than 200 mummies staring back at them from the darkness of the chulpas, or burial towers. These were not the skeletal remains one might expect to find in such a humid, rain-drenched environment. Instead, they were perfectly preserved individuals, their skin turned to the color of polished mahogany, their features so intact that they seemed merely to be caught in a deep, dreamless sleep. The preservation was a miracle of both nature and artifice. The Chachapoya had utilized the natural microclimate of the dry cliff ledges, shielded from the torrential rains by overhanging rock, but they had also mastered a sophisticated system of embalming. As we look closely at these silent residents of the lake, we see the meticulous care of a people who did not view death as an ending, but as a transition into a different kind of presence. The internal organs had been removed through the lower body, and the cavities filled with herbal preservatives and cotton. Even the skin had been treated with resins and oils to ward off the decay of the centuries. Many of the mummies were found in a fetal position, their knees tucked tight against their chests and their hands cradled against their cheeks, a posture of return, as if they were preparing to be reborn from the womb of the mountain itself. They were wrapped in layers of fine cotton textiles, some of which still bore the vibrant dyes of blue and ochre that were fresh when the world was young. But as the researchers began to untangle the layers of cloth, they found a story that was far more complex than a simple Chachapoya burial. The Lake of the Condors was a site of transition in more ways than one. Within the tombs, the techniques of the Cloud People were intertwined with the unmistakable influence of the Inca Empire. Some of the mummies were prepared in the traditional Chachapoya fashion, while others showed the distinct mummy bundle style favored by the lords of Cusco. It became clear that this was a sacred site that had survived the conquest of the Andes, a place where the conquered and the conquerors eventually shared the same cold stone beds. The stratigraphy, the study of the layers of soil and remains over time, showed that the Inca had not destroyed the Chachapoya's sacred places, but had instead co-opted them, layering their own royalty alongside the ancient kings of the clouds. The grave goods found scattered among the silent sleepers offer us a window into a world of vast interconnectedness. Despite their isolation in the high, misty forests, the people of the lake were part of a trade network that stretched for thousands of miles. Archaeologists found exquisite pottery, carved wooden figurines, and most surprisingly, the remains of tropical birds and shells from the distant Pacific coast. They were quipus, those mysterious, knotted strings used by the Inca to record history and accounting, suggesting that even here, at the edge of the known world, the bureaucratic hand of the empire was felt. We find evidence of a diet that was rich and varied, far beyond the simple tubers of the high altitude. They ate maize, beans, and chili peppers, and the presence of coca leaves suggests a deep spiritual connection to the plants of the lowlands, used perhaps to numb the cold or to facilitate the visions required by their shamans. As the years pass and our technology improves, the mummies of the Laguna de los Condores continue to whisper their secrets. Radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic matter, tells us that some of these individuals were placed here as late as the year 1500, just decades before the arrival of the Spanish. They lived through the twilight of their own civilization and the dawn of the Inca occupation, witnessing a world in constant flux. And yet, looking at their preserved faces, one does not feel a sense of turmoil. There is only a profound, heavy stillness. The mystery of their appearance remains one of the most debated topics in Andean archaeology. Early Spanish chroniclers, such as Pedro Chiesa de León, remarked with astonishment that the Chachapoya were the whitest and most handsome of all the people they encountered in the New World, noting that the women were especially sought after by the Inca royalty for their light skin and light-colored eyes. While modern DNA analysis is still painting a full picture, the skeletal remains at the lake show a population that was, on average, taller and more robust than many of their neighbors. Was this the result of a unique genetic pocket, isolated for thousands of years in the clouds, or is there a deeper, more ancient story of migration that we have yet to uncover? The Lake of the Condors acts as a mirror, reflecting back our own questions about the limits of human endurance and the desire to be remembered. The Chachapoya went to incredible lengths to ensure that their ancestors remained present, peering out from their high galleries at the world they once ruled. They did not bury their dead beneath the earth to be forgotten. They raised them up, closer to the sky, where the condors circle in the thin, cold air. As the mist rolls off the black water of the laguna and snakes its way up the limestone cliffs, one can almost imagine the spirits of the 200 mummies still watching, still waiting for the clouds to part and reveal the secrets of the ages. The artifacts tell us of their wealth, and the mummies tell us of their health, but it is the location itself that tells us of their soul. To carry a body hundreds of feet up a vertical cliff, to build stone houses for the dead in a place where even the living struggle to breathe, requires a devotion that borders on the divine. It suggests a civilization that viewed the landscape not as a resource to be exploited, but as a sacred map, where every peak and every hidden lake held a specific spiritual weight. As we move away from the silent watchers of the lake and continue our journey into the heart of their empire, we find that this reverence for the heights was not limited to their tombs. It was the very foundation of their cities, their fortresses, and their identity as the people who lived where the earth meets the heavens. Pedro Chiesa de León, a Spanish chronicler who traversed the rugged spine of the Andes in the middle of the 16th century, paused his travels when he encountered a people who seemed to defy the expectations of the old world. He wrote of the Chachapoya with a sense of genuine bewilderment, describing them as the whitest and most handsome of all the people he had met in the Indies. He noted that their women were so fair and graceful that they were often sought after by the Inca nobility and later by the Spanish themselves. These accounts, written in the flickering light of colonial camps, planted a seed of mystery that has grown over 5 centuries into a forest of speculation. The image of a fair-skinned, light-haired warrior race living in the clouds is a striking one, evoking a sense of cognitive dissonance against the backdrop of the South American rainforest. For generations, these descriptions led many to wonder if the Chachapoya were truly different in their biological essence, or if the Spanish observers were seeing something that wasn't entirely there. Perhaps, it was suggested, the chroniclers were projecting their own ideals of beauty and status onto a population they found particularly sophisticated. Or perhaps there was a physical reality to these claims that science might one day be able to touch. When we look closely at the skeletal remains recovered from the high cliffside tombs, the story becomes more nuanced. Archaeologists and bioanthropologists have spent decades examining the crania and long bones of those who once walked the streets of Kuelap. In some instances, mummified remains have been found with hair that appears surprisingly light, shades of chestnut, ginger, or honey blonde. This has fueled fringe theories for years, with some suggesting that the Chachapoya were the descendants of lost Phoenician sailors, wandering Celts, or even Viking explorers who had somehow navigated the Amazon River to its very headwaters. These ideas are romantic and stir the imagination, suggesting a world of ancient, transoceanic contact that predates Columbus by 1,000 years. However, the cold light of genetic science tells a more grounded, yet equally fascinating story. Recent studies of mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line, indicate that the Chachapoya were fundamentally an indigenous Andean people. Their genetic markers align closely with other groups from the Amazon basin and the surrounding highlands. The fairness described by Chiesa de Leon may not have been the result of European or Middle Eastern blood, but rather a unique expression of local evolution and environmental adaptation. To understand this, we must consider the environment of the Ceja de Selva, the eyebrow of the jungle. In these high-altitude cloud forests, the sun is often obscured by a thick, perpetual veil of mist and moisture. For a people living at 10,000 feet, the ultraviolet exposure is intense when the sky is clear, but the Chachapoya spent much of their lives beneath a canopy of grey. This lack of direct sunlight, combined with a diet rich in specific mountain minerals, can affect the pigmentation of the skin and hair over many generations. Furthermore, the process of mummification itself can play tricks on the eyes of the living. The chemical changes that occur in the hair after death, a process known as reddening, can strip the dark melanin from the strands, leaving behind the lighter, reddish pigments that survive longer in the arid or protected environments of a stone sarcophagus. And so, we find ourselves at a crossroads between the written word of the past and the molecular evidence of the present. While the fringe theories of transoceanic voyages provide a sense of grand adventure, the reality of the Chachapoya is perhaps more impressive. They were a people who had so perfectly adapted to their vertical world that they began to look like the clouds they inhabited. Their physical appearance was a testament to their isolation and their mastery of a landscape that would have broken lesser cultures. As we move deeper into the scientific analysis, we encounter the concept of phenotypic plasticity, the way an organism's physical traits can change in response to its environment without a change in its underlying DNA. The Chachapoya may have been a living example of this, their bodies reflecting the cool, damp and shaded world of the high Andes. The Spanish, arriving from the sun-drenched plains of Castile, would have seen a people whose skin had not been darkened by the relentless sun of the coast or the low-lying jungles. To them, this was a mark of distinction, a sign of a noble race that fit their own internal hierarchies. The mystery of their origin is further complicated by the sheer antiquity of the sites. Using radiocarbon dating, a method that measures the decay of carbon isotopes in organic material to determine its age, researchers have found that the Chachapoya culture began to coalesce as early as the 8th or 9th century. This was a time of great upheaval in the Andes, as older empires like the Wari began to fragment and fade. In the vacuum left behind, the Chachapoya carved out a kingdom in the most inaccessible reaches of the mountains. They were not newcomers from across the sea, but a people who had emerged from the very soil and stone of the cloud forest. Even the most rigorous genetic testing cannot fully erase the sense of otherness that surrounds the Chachapoya. There is a persistent quality to the artifacts they left behind. The strange, bulbous-headed stone carvings, the hauntingly human faces on their sarcophagi, and the intricate geometric patterns of their masonry, that suggests a culture that was consciously separating itself from its neighbors. They were the people of the peaks, and they seemed to take pride in their difference. As the years pass and our technology improves, we may find more definitive answers. Perhaps there is a small, hidden percentage of their genome that we have yet to fully decode, or perhaps the fairness was simply a trait that was naturally selected for in the high-altitude gloom. But for the listener drifting toward sleep, the truth remains beautifully elusive. The Chachapoya stand on the edge of history, their faces pale against the dark green of the mountain, their eyes blue as the glacial lakes, watching an empire rise and fall beneath them. We must also consider the role of diet in their physical development. The Chachapoya were master farmers of the slopes, cultivating varieties of potatoes, maize, and tubers that were specifically adapted to the thin air. Their consumption of certain plants, high in specific antioxidants and minerals, could have influenced their health and appearance in ways that archaeology is only just beginning to understand. The relationship between a people and the food they pull from the earth is a deep, biological conversation, one that shapes the bones and the skin over centuries of quiet growth. The silence of the ruins at Kuelap is not an empty silence. It is a silence filled with the echoes of these questions. As we walk through the circular houses, we can almost see them, the tall, fair warriors and their graceful families moving through the mist. They were a bridge between the known and the unknown, a civilization that reached for the light while keeping its feet firmly planted in the ancient shadows of the Andes. The mystery of their appearance is not just a question of biology, but a question of identity, a question of how a people chooses to see themselves and how they are seen by the world that eventually consumes them. As the night deepens and the air grows still, we realize that the Chachapoya do not need to be lost Europeans to be extraordinary. Their story is one of resilience, of a deep and abiding connection to a land that most would find uninhabitable. They were the architects of the clouds, the guardians of the high passes, and their legacy is written in the very pigment of their descendants who still live in the valley of the Utcubamba River today. The fair skin and light eyes mentioned by the chroniclers may be rare now, but the spirit of the Chachapoya remains, a ghost in the machinery of the modern world, reminding us that the past is never truly gone. It is simply waiting to be remembered in the quiet moments before the dawn. A single sharp whistle echoes across the Utcubamba Valley, carried on a wind that smells of damp moss and ancient stone. It is a sound that would have been familiar 1,000 years ago. A signal passed from one limestone ridge to the next, leaping across the yawning chasms that separate the world of the living from the peaks of the gods. To understand the Chachapoya, one must first understand the geography that sculpted their souls. They were not a monolithic empire like the Inca, who would eventually come to conquer them, but rather a tapestry of fiercely independent threads, woven together by culture but pulled apart by the sheer verticality of the Andes. As we look closer at the ruins clinging to these emerald slopes, a complex social mosaic begins to emerge, a collection of decentralized competing territories known as curacazgos. Each valley, each isolated plateau, functioned as its own small kingdom, governed by a local lord known as a curaca. These leaders were not distant, godlike figures living in golden palaces. They were the protectors of their specific clan, the arbiters of water rights, and the directors of the massive labor required to terrace the steep mountainsides. The curaca was the bridge between the people and the land, a man whose authority was rooted in the immediate needs of survival in an environment that offered no margin for error. Life in these high-altitude chiefdoms was a delicate balance of cooperation and conflict. While the Chachapoya shared a common identity, the scarcity of prime agricultural land and the prestige of the high ridges often led to friction between neighboring groups. We see the evidence of this tension in the very architecture they left behind. Almost every major settlement is a fortress, a defensive lookout perched on a knife-edge cliff, where the only approach is a narrow, winding path that could be defended by a handful of warriors. These were not just homes, they were watchtowers. From the circular stone houses of Kuelap to the smaller outposts hidden in the cloud forest, the layout of their world suggests a people who lived in a state of constant, watchful readiness. Intertribal warfare was likely a seasonal reality, a ritualized struggle for resources, or perhaps a way to settle ancestral debts that had been forgotten by everyone but the stones themselves. And yet, despite this political fragmentation, despite the constant skirmishing between the Curacas, there was a profound sense of unity that transcended the borders of the individual valleys. When we look at the artifacts recovered from the burial sites, the intricate weavings, the distinctive pottery with its geometric zigzags, and the way they positioned their dead to face the rising sun, we see a people who spoke the same spiritual language. They shared a religious pantheon that centered on the power of the mountains and the spirits of the ancestors who inhabited the cliffs. They were bound by a common tongue, likely an early form of the Quechua, or a related dialect that has since faded into the mists of time, allowing a traveller from the northern reaches of the territory to find common ground with a farmer from the south. It is a fascinating paradox. A civilization that was politically broken into 100 pieces, yet culturally held together by a single, unbreakable bond. They were a confederation of the clouds, a loose alliance of mountain lords, who knew that while they might fight over a stream or a pasture today, they were all children of the same mist-covered peaks. The Curaca was the heart of this system, providing a localized stability that allowed for the construction of massive stoneworks that seem impossible for such small groups to have achieved alone. It suggests a high degree of social organization, a way of mobilizing hundreds of people to haul limestone blocks up thousands of vertical feet, not through the whims of a distant emperor, but through the shared necessity of the community. As the centuries drifted by, these hilltop lookouts became more than just defenses, they became symbols of identity. The higher a clan could build, the closer they were to the celestial realm, and the more prestige their Curaca commanded. We can imagine the smoke from 100 small fires rising from these ridges at dusk, a network of lights signaling to one another across the dark voids of the canyons, a silent conversation between rivals who were, in the end, brothers of the same high wilderness. The social structure of the Chachapoya was a reflection of the Andes themselves, jagged, divided, and incredibly difficult to navigate, yet part of a single, magnificent range that defined the horizon of their existence. In the quiet of the high altitudes, one can almost feel the presence of the Curacas still lingering in the shadows of the doorways. They were men of the earth and the sky, leaders who understood that in the land of the clouds, power was not measured in gold, but in the ability to hold one's ground against the elements and the ambitions of one's neighbors. This decentralized way of life made them incredibly resilient, for there was no single capital to capture, no single king to topple. To conquer the Chachapoya, an invader would have to take every ridge, every valley, and every fortress one by one, a task that would eventually exhaust even the greatest empires of the ancient world. The scent of cold rain on limestone and the muffled sound of distant thunder were the only warnings the mountain people had before the shadow of the Sapa Inca began to climb their slopes. For centuries, the Chachapoya had lived in a state of fierce, fragmented independence, but in the year 1470, the horizon changed forever. From the south, like a slow-moving tide of bronze and wool, came the armies of Tupac Inca Yupanqui. He was the son of Pachacuti, the world shaper, and he carried with him the absolute conviction that his father's sun god, Inti, demanded the submission of every living soul beneath the sky. As the Inca's scouts peered through the shifting mists, they did not see a unified kingdom, but 1,000 defiant eyes looking back at them from the cliffside tombs and the high circular walls of the ridge-top citadels. The conquest of the Chachapoya was not to be a swift campaign of a few months, but a grueling, decades-long ordeal that would test the very limits of the Inca war machine. Tupac Inca Yupanqui was accustomed to the rapid capitulation of lowland tribes who were awed by the splendor of Cusco, but the people of the clouds were made of different stuff. They were masters of the vertical world, and they used the geography of the Andes as a weapon. Every narrow mountain pass became a death trap. Every suspension bridge over a roaring gorge was cut just as the Inca vanguard stepped onto the swaying hemp. The Inca soldiers, accustomed to the high, dry plateaus of the Altiplano, found themselves struggling in the humid, oxygen-thin air of the cloud forests, where the moss-covered rocks were as slick as ice, and the dense foliage hid warriors who seemed to vanish into the fog like ghosts. The resistance was led by local chieftains who refused to bow, forcing the Sun King to take the land inch by agonizing inch. It is said that the Inca was so frustrated by the tenacity of the Chachapoya that he was forced to build his own roads and supply lines deep into the wilderness just to keep his army fed. This was a war of attrition played out above the eagles, a slow, methodical strangulation of a culture that valued its liberty above its life. The Chachapoya fought with slings and stone maces, their white tunics stained with the red clay of the earth, retreating further and further into their most inaccessible fortresses as the Inca pushed northward. Eventually, even the greatest walls begin to crumble under the weight of an empire that has no end to its resources. The focus of the conflict inevitably turned toward Kuelap, that massive stone heart of the Chachapoya world. We can only imagine the scene as the Inca legions surrounded the great limestone plateau, their golden standards glinting in the pale mountain sun. The siege of Kuelap was likely a long and quiet affair, a slow starvation of the spirit as much as the body. When the fortress finally fell, it did not mark just the end of a battle, but the end of an era. The Inca did not merely want to rule the Chachapoya, they wanted to dismantle the very idea of them. To ensure that the people of the clouds would never rise again, the Inca implemented the system of mitma, a policy of forced resettlement that was as effective as it was cruel. Tens of thousands of Chachapoya were uprooted from their ancestral peaks and marched hundreds of miles away to the distant corners of the empire, to the hot coastal deserts or the cold southern plains where they were strangers in a strange land. In their place, the Inca moved loyal subjects from the heart of the empire into the cloud forests, blending the populations until the original lineages were blurred and broken. This was a form of cultural erasure, a way to thin the blood and the memory of a people who had dared to defy the sun. And yet, even in defeat, the Chachapoya left a mark upon their conquerors that was impossible to ignore. The Inca were a pragmatic people. They recognized strength when they saw it. They were so impressed by the height, the fair skin, and the legendary bravery of the Chachapoya men that they did something unusual. They selected the most elite of the surviving Chachapoya warriors and brought them to Cusco, not as slaves, but as the personal imperial guard of the Sapa Inca himself. It is a haunting image to consider. The High King of the Inca, the most powerful man in the Western Hemisphere, walking through his palace halls, protected by the very men whose homes he had destroyed and whose families he had displaced. These tall, light-eyed warriors stood as silent sentinels at the gates of the Temple of the Sun, their presence a constant reminder of a civilization that had been broken, but whose spirit was still formidable enough to guard the life of a god. As the years passed and the 15th century drew to a close, the Chachapoya region became a province of the Tawantinsuyu, the Empire of the Four Quarters. They were forced to learn Quechua, to terrace their mountains in the Inca style, and to pay tribute in the form of fine textiles and exotic bird feathers. But beneath the surface of this imposed order, the resentment simmered. The memory of the high ridges and the ancient circular houses remained, whispered in the dark corners of the Mitma colonies. The Inca had conquered the land and the people, but they had not yet conquered the mystery of why these people looked so different, why they buried their dead in the air, and what ancient secrets they still carried in their hearts. The integration was never truly complete. The Chachapoya remained a distinct thread in the vast tapestry of the empire, a thread that was stronger and more resilient than the Inca realized. They waited in the shadows of their new lives, watching the sky, perhaps sensing that another change was coming, a change that would arrive not from the mountains to the south, but from the great sea to the east, bringing with it a new kind of god and a new kind of destruction. For now, the mountains were quiet. The great stones of Kuelap settled into a forced silence, and the blue-eyed kings became legends in their own time, serving an empire that had tried to swallow them whole. In the quiet of the high altitude, where the air is thin and the stars feel close enough to touch, one can almost hear the echoes of that lost defiance. The Inca thought they had solved the problem of the Chachapoya through displacement and assimilation, but history has a way of preserving what is meant to be remembered. The ruins didn't disappear. They were simply reclaimed by the vines and the moss, waiting for a time when their story could be told again. The forced migrations had spread the Chachapoya DNA across the continent, a silent migration of genes that would survive long after the Inca Empire itself had turned to dust. As we look back at this period of conquest, we are left with more questions than answers. How did the Chachapoya feel as they stood guard in Cusco, watching the rituals of a sun they did not truly worship? Did they look toward the northern horizon, toward the clouds that still clung to their ancestral homes, and dream of a return? The Inca chronicles speak of their bravery, but they do not speak of their sorrow. We are left to find that sorrow in the stones of the abandoned citadels and the lonely positions of the sarcophagi that still look out over the valleys, eternally watching for an enemy that has long since passed into the realm of myth. History is often written by the victors, but for the Chachapoya, the ink was forged in the heat of a desperate gamble, a choice made in the flickering shadows of a world that was rapidly unraveling. When the first whispers of bearded men arriving on the coast began to filter up through the mountain passes, the people of the clouds did not see them as harbingers of an apocalypse. They saw them as an answer to a prayer. For decades, the Chachapoya had lived under the heavy yoke of the Inca, their culture suppressed, their families relocated, and their sacred mountains turned into a sprawling, administrative province of an empire that demanded their total submission. To a people who had once breathed the thin, free air of the high ridges, the arrival of Francisco Pizarro and his small band of Spanish soldiers in 1532 represented a crack in the monolithic wall of Inca power. As the Spanish moved inland, they found a land already fractured by a brutal civil war between the rival Inca brothers, Atahualpa and Huasca. The Chachapoya, sensing that the moment for their liberation had arrived, did not retreat into their fortresses or rain arrows down upon the steel-clad strangers. Instead, they reached out. Early colonial records, penned by chroniclers like Pedro Chiesa de Leon, describe a remarkable alignment of interests. The Chachapoya leaders saw in the Spanish a tool, a sharp metallic instrument that could be used to sever the ties that bound them to Cusco. They offered the conquistadors more than just safe passage. They offered their knowledge of the terrain, their formidable skills in mountain warfare, and thousands of warriors who were eager to reclaim a sovereignty that had been stolen generations prior. The transition from resistance against the Inca to alliance with the Spanish was swift, driven by a hope that, in hindsight, carries a profound and quiet tragedy. In the pivotal battles that followed, the support of the Chachapoya was not merely helpful. It was often the deciding factor that allowed a few hundred Spaniards to survive in a landscape of millions. During the siege of Cusco, when the Inca forces under Manco Inca nearly succeeded in wiping out the European invaders, it was the Chachapoya, along with other disillusioned groups like the Cañari, who stood on the front lines. They fought through the narrow, stone-paved streets of the capital, their distinctive slings and clubs clashing against the very empire that had once tried to erase their identity. They provided the logistics, the food, and the intelligence that allowed the Spanish to endure, believing all the while that once the Inca were defeated, the strangers would leave, or at the very least, allow the cloud people to return to their ancestral ways of life. There is a particular sadness in reflecting on these early colonial records, which detail how the Chachapoya fought with a ferocity born of a long-suppressed desire for home. They believed they were fighting for their freedom. Yet with every Inca stronghold they helped topple, they were inadvertently tightening the noose of a much more absolute and alien subjugation. The Spanish were not merely another local power looking for tribute. They were the vanguard of a global empire with a hunger for gold and soul conversion that the Andean world had never before encountered. As the dust settled over the ruins of Cusco, the Chachapoya found that their new allies were far more demanding than the masters they had just helped to overthrow. As the years passed, the alliance began to sour into a grim reality of exploitation. The Spanish recognized the Chachapoya for their bravery and initially granted some of their leaders special status. But this was a fleeting comfort. The very traits that had made the Chachapoya legendary, their resilience, their height, and their striking appearance, now made them subjects of intense curiosity and eventually victims of the brutal encomienda system. This was a labor structure where the Spanish crown granted settlers the right to the labor of specific groups of indigenous people. The cloud people, who had once answered only to the wind and the spirits of their ancestors, were now forced into mines and onto plantations, their numbers beginning to dwindle as European diseases, to which they had no immunity, began to sweep through the damp, high-altitude forests. The tragedy of the Chachapoya is often framed as a military conquest, but it was perhaps more a conquest of hope. They had looked toward the horizon and seen the white sails of the Spanish ships as white wings of deliverance. They could not have known that the steel swords and the strange animals were the tools of a world that would eventually leave their great stone cities like Kuelap silent and empty. In those early days of the conquest, as they marched alongside Pizarro's men, did they feel a sense of triumph? As they looked upon the fallen walls of Inca temples, did they believe that the age of the sun was over and the age of the clouds was returning? We find the remnants of this era in the fragmented accounts of the 16th century, where Spanish administrators recorded the great service the Chachapoya rendered to the King of Spain. These documents are cold and bureaucratic, listing the names of chieftains and the numbers of warriors provided, yet between the lines one can sense the slow realization of a people who had traded a known enemy for an unknowable one. The sophisticated stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and historical debris of this period shows a sudden and violent shift in the archaeological record. The traditional pottery and tools of the Chachapoya begin to vanish, replaced by the crude, mass-produced items of the early colonial era, marking the moment when a distinct and vibrant culture began to dissolve into the grey fog of history. It is a sobering thought to consider that the very bravery that allowed them to survive the Inca expansion was the quality that the Spanish most exploited to ensure the fall of the Andes. The Chachapoya were masters of the heights, and they led the Conquistadors to the most secret places, opening the veins of the mountains to those who would drain them of their riches. As the sun set on the final days of the independent Chachapoya, the silence in the cloud forests must have grown heavier. The great sarcophagi on the cliffs of Karagia continued to watch, their clay faces impassive, as the world below them changed forever. They saw the fires of the old villages go out, one by one, and they saw the paths that had once been worn smooth by the feet of thousands grow over with moss and vines. In the quiet of the modern Andean night, one can almost hear the echoes of that impossible choice. To side with a stranger against a neighbor is a gamble as old as time, a recurring theme in the deep history of our species. The Chachapoya were not the first, nor would they be the last, to seek liberation through a new master, only to find that the price of freedom was their very existence. Their story is a reminder of the fragility of civilization and how easily the threads of a culture can be unraveled when caught between the gears of competing empires. We are left with the stones, the mist, and the records of men who did not understand the world they were destroying, and the ghosts of those who tried, with every ounce of their strength, to save a home that was already slipping away into the realm of memory. A single breath can carry a world of change, yet the most devastating winds to ever sweep across the Andes were invisible, silent, and entirely indifferent to the grandeur of the civilizations they encountered. Long before the first Spanish iron clinked against the stones of the cloud forest, something else had arrived, a microscopic vanguard that moved faster than any messenger, travelling along the very highland roads the Inca had built to unify their fractured realm. Smallpox, a disease for which the people of the Americas had no biological memory and no ancestral defense, rippled through the mountains like a wildfire in a dry season. It was followed closely by measles and influenza, forming a relentless tide of biological upheaval that decimated populations before a single battle could be joined. As the 16th century progressed, the high, mist-shrouded ridges of the Chachapoya began to experience a profound and eerie quiet. In the bustling markets of the cloud forest, where once the scent of coca leaves and exotic bird feathers filled the air, the voices began to thin. It is estimated by modern scholars that within a few short decades, nearly 90% of the indigenous population of the Andes vanished. For the Chachapoya, who had already been weary from generations of resistance against the Inca and subsequent exploitation by the Spanish, this was the final crushing weight. The social fabric did not just tear, it dissolved. The complex systems of terrace farming, the intricate social hierarchies, and the ancient lineages of the blue-eyed lords were severed by a force they could neither see nor understand. Even as the Spanish attempted to count their new subjects for the purpose of taxation and labor, the numbers dwindled so rapidly that the ledgers became records of ghosts. The great Fortress of Kuelap, that massive limestone crown sitting atop the mountain at 9,000 feet, began to feel the heavy hand of abandonment. The sounds of daily life, the grinding of grain, the laughter of children, the rhythmic tapping of stonemasons faded into the sighing of the wind. Without the constant effort of thousands of hands to hold back the encroaching green, the cloud forest began its patient, inevitable reclamation. Vines as thick as a man's arm started to coil around the circular houses, their roots prying into the mortar of the massive outer walls. Moss draped itself over the intricate zigzag friezes, softening the sharp edges of the stone until the architecture seemed to blend back into the natural cliffside. As the years passed, the jungle did not just cover Kuelap. It inhaled it, swallowing the city whole until it was nothing more than a rumor whispered by the few survivors who remained in the valleys below. Meanwhile, a more subtle and perhaps more tragic loss was occurring. The silencing of the Chachapoya language. We know so little of how they spoke, for they left no written records, and their oral traditions were tied to the very people who were now perishing in the thousands. The Spanish, in their quest to administer the vast territories of the new kingdom of Granada and the vice-royalty of Peru, favored the use of Quechua, the language of the conquered Inca, as a lingua franca for conversion and control. As the Chachapoya were relocated into reducciones, or forced Spanish-style settlements, their native tongue was layered over, suppressed, and eventually forgotten. The names of their gods, the lyrics of their songs, and the specific nuances of their history were lost to the passage of time, leaving us only with a few place names and the echoing silence of the high peaks. It is a strange and somber reality to consider that a culture so vibrant, so fiercely independent, could be erased so thoroughly that even their true name for themselves is a matter of debate. The term Chachapoya is likely a Quechua word, a name given to them by their enemies, meaning people of the clouds. As the 16th century drew to a close, the survivors were absorbed into the colonial tapestry, their unique identity blurring into the broader indigenous population. The great stone cities, once the pride of the Andes, became tombs of memory, hidden by a canopy of emerald leaves and a shroud of eternal mist. The world moved on. The empires of man rose and fell, but the cloud forest kept its secrets, guarding the ruins of a lost kingdom that had once dared to touch the sky. As the 17th century dawned, the depopulation reached its nadir. The highlands were so empty that Spanish travellers often remarked on the haunting beauty of abandoned terraces that stretched for miles, perfectly constructed stone stairs leading to nowhere, built by a people who were no longer there to walk them. The loss of these populations meant the loss of the ecological knowledge required to maintain such a delicate balance in the high-altitude tropics. The irrigation channels, once marvels of hydraulic engineering, became clogged with silt and debris. The forests, which had been carefully managed for timber and medicinal plants, grew wild and impenetrable. The landscape itself seemed to be grieving, retreating into a primordial state as if trying to erase the scars of human ambition. In this period of deep decline, the very memory of Kuelap and Gran Payaten began to slip into the realm of myth. For the local inhabitants who remained in the lower valleys, the ruins high above were no longer seen as the homes of their grandfathers, but as the dwellings of ancient, powerful spirits, the abuelos, or ancestors, who must be respected and feared. The physical connection to the past was broken, replaced by a spiritual reverence born of distance and mystery. The blue-eyed kings and the warriors of the mist were gone, leaving behind only the cold, damp stones and a silence that would last for centuries, until the modern world finally looked upward once more and wondered who had lived among the clouds. The silence of the high Amazonas is never truly empty. It is a heavy, living thing, composed of the rhythmic drip of condensation from bromeliads and the distant, muffled calls of birds hidden deep within the canopy. For nearly 300 years, this green shroud remained undisturbed, weaving itself through the gaps in the limestone blocks of Kuelap, until the mid-19th century brought a new kind of intruder to the mountain ridges. It was the year 1843, and a local judge named Juan Crisostomo Nieto was led by his guides through the thickets of the Luya province, hacking through vines that seemed to regenerate as quickly as they were cut. When he finally stood before the massive, curved walls of the fortress, he did not see a ruin. He saw a mountain made of human hands, rising 60 feet into the air, crowned with trees that had taken root in the very floors of the ancient roundhouses. Nieto's report to the prefect of Amazonas spoke of a monument so vast that it defied the known history of the region, yet the world beyond the Andes was slow to listen. The fortress remained a local legend, a ghost in the fog, until the mid-20th century, when the spirit of exploration took on a more fevered, almost obsessive quality. The most prominent of these modern seekers was Jean Savoy, an American explorer who arrived in the 1960s with a conviction that the Amazonian cloud forests held the keys to a forgotten seafaring empire. Savoy was a man who looked at the landscape not just as a geographer, but as a hunter of myths. He pushed deeper into the Vilcabamba and the northern highlands than almost any outsider before him, documenting thousands of structures that had been swallowed by the earth. It was during these expeditions that the scale of the Chachapoya civilization began to emerge, not as a collection of isolated villages, but as a continuous, vibrating network of thousands of stone settlements, linked by narrow trails that clung to the edges of precipices. Working in this environment, however, is a task that humbles even the most seasoned archaeologists. The Amazonas region is a place of relentless humidity and sudden, violent rains that turn the steep mountain paths into rivers of mud. To excavate here is to fight a constant battle against the decomposition of history itself. In the humid heat, organic materials like wood, textiles, and skin usually vanish within a few decades, leaving only the cold stone behind. The preservation of the mummies found in the high cliffs was a miracle of microclimates, a rare alignment of dry air and sheltered rock that allowed the people of the mist to keep their faces. But for the vast majority of the Chachapoya world, the record is written in stratigraphy, the study of the layers of soil and debris that accumulate over time, where a single inch of earth might represent 100 years of human life. Archaeologists must meticulously brush away the rot of the jungle to find the carbonized remains of ancient fires, using radiocarbon dating to pin these fleeting moments to a timeline that stretches back over 1,000 years. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, the tools of the hunt began to change, moving from the machete to the lens of the satellite. The perspective shifted from the forest floor to the heavens, and the results have been nothing short of transformative. High-resolution satellite imagery and LiDAR, a technology that uses laser pulses to map the ground surface through the densest tree canopy, have begun to strip away the green veil of the Andes. What appeared to be natural hills are revealed to be terraced platforms. What seemed like chaotic forest growth is shown to be the orderly layout of plazas and residential complexes. These technologies have recently identified hundreds of previously unknown structures, suggesting that the population of the Chachapoya was far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had dared to imagine. It is as if a giant map is being slowly illuminated, one pixel at a time, revealing a civilization that did not just live in the mountains, but reshaped the mountains themselves into a sprawling, vertical megalopolis. And yet, despite these technological leaps, the fundamental mystery remains as thick as the morning mist. Each new discovery brings with it a fresh set of questions that seem to slip through the fingers of mainstream science. Why did these people choose the most inaccessible ridges for their homes? How did they transport the millions of tons of limestone required to build Kuelap without the use of the wheel or large draft animals? And most hauntingly, why does their physical appearance, recorded in the earliest Spanish chronicles and suggested by the skeletal remains, seem so distinct from the neighbors who eventually conquered them? As we peel back the layers of moss and time, we find ourselves standing in the same position as Juan Crisóstomo Nieto nearly 2 centuries ago, staring at a wall of stone that guards its secrets with a quiet, stubborn pride. The modern era has rediscovered the Chachapoya, but it has not yet understood them. we are left to wonder if the answers are still hidden in the unexplored valleys to the east, or if they were carried away by the wind long ago, leaving us only with the echoes of the abuelos. To understand the Chachapoya, one must first learn to look not at the ground beneath their feet, but at the shifting boundary where the mountain top meets the mist. In the stillness of the high altitude, the air grows thin, and it is here, in the silence of the peaks, that the spiritual architecture of the cloud people begins to reveal itself. They did not view the world as a collection of separate objects, but as a living, breathing tapestry woven together by 3 sacred threads. In the intricate carvings that adorn their stone friezes and the woven patterns of their textiles, a trinity of power constantly emerges. First is the feline, the jaguar of the lowlands, representing the strength and hidden stealth of the earth. Then comes the serpent, a creature that moves between the water and the land, symbolizing the winding rivers and the cyclical nature of time itself. But held in highest regard was the condor, the great scavenger of the skies, whose massive wingspan allowed it to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. To the Chachapoya, these animals were more than mere symbols. They were the guardians of the 3 levels of existence, ensuring that the balance between the dark earth and the light of the heavens remained undisturbed. As we trace the lines of their circular dwellings at Kuelap and Gran Pachaten, we see that their spirituality was not confined to temples, but was etched into the very orientation of their lives. The Chachapoya were masters of celestial alignment, a practice known to archaeologists as archaeoastronomy. They built their massive stone walls and narrow doorways to capture the precise moment when the sun crests over specific jagged peaks during the solstices. During these moments, the light does not merely illuminate the stone, it activates it, turning a cold fortress into a sundial of immense proportions. They believed that the mountains themselves were apus, or living deities, and by aligning their homes with these peaks, they were anchoring their civilization to the eternal power of the earth. In the quiet hours of the night, under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, the Chachapoya shamans would begin their rituals. We know from the discovery of small carved snuff trays and bone tubes that they made extensive use of hallucinogenic plants, likely traded from the deep Amazonian basin to the east. One such plant was the San Pedro cactus, containing mescaline, which allowed the shaman to enter a state of trance. In this altered consciousness, the boundaries of the physical world would dissolve. The stone walls of the city would seem to breathe, and the shaman would fly alongside the condor to consult with the spirits of the dead. This was not a religion of fear, but one of communication, a constant dialogue between the seen and the unseen, mediated by those who knew how to walk between worlds. The very name we give them today, the Cloud People, is perhaps the most accurate description of their spiritual identity. They saw themselves as intermediaries, a bridge between the humid, fertile chaos of the jungle below and the cold, crystalline purity of the heavens above. They lived in the eyebrow of the forest, a place of perpetual dampness and swirling fog, where a person might disappear into a cloud and reappear a moment later as if by magic. This environment shaped a belief system where nothing was permanent and everything was in a state of transition. To die was not to cease existing, but to move further into the mist, becoming one of the abuelos who watched over the living from their high, inaccessible sarcophagi. As the centuries passed, this connection to the cosmos became their greatest strength and, perhaps, their most profound mystery. They did not build to dominate nature, but to harmonize with its most extreme expressions. Every zigzag pattern on a wall, every feline head carved into a lintel, and every building aligned with the rising moon was a prayer in stone, a way of ensuring that even when the clouds descended to swallow their cities whole, the spirit of the Chachapoya would remain tethered to the stars. We are left to contemplate the depth of a faith that saw no distinction between the flight of a bird, the path of a planet, and the breath of a human being, all of them moving together in a slow celestial dance that continues even now, long after the dancers have vanished into the white silence of the Andes. A single rhythmic sound echoes through the damp corridors of the forest, a sound that has remained unchanged for thousands of years, the steady, hypnotic clack of a wooden loom. In the high, misty reaches where the Andes meet the Amazonian basin, the Chachapoya did not merely build in stone, they wove their identity into the very fibers of their world. While their fortresses stood as silent sentinels against the horizon, a different kind of mastery was unfolding within the walls of their circular homes. Here, the rugged utility of survival met an aesthetic of profound complexity, a visual language that spoke of a people who saw beauty as a necessary companion to strength. As the morning fog clings to the jagged peaks, we find ourselves looking closely at the surfaces of their great stone walls. These are not the smooth, polished ashlar blocks of the Inca, who would arrive much later with their visions of empire and order. Instead, the Chachapoya decorated their architecture with elaborate friezes, long undulating bands of stone that wrap around the circumference of their buildings like a petrified ribbon. These patterns are geometric and relentless, repeating in motifs of zigzags and diamonds that seem to vibrate when the sun hits them at a certain angle. Some scholars suggest these shapes represent the sacred eyes of the jaguar, or perhaps the stylized scales of a serpent winding its way through the undergrowth. Others see in them a map of the mountains themselves, a rhythmic interpretation of the peaks and valleys that define their existence. These friezes were not merely decorative, they were a form of masonry storytelling, a way of embedding the soul of the community into the physical structure of their shelters. The labor required to create such intricate stonework is staggering when one considers the terrain. Each small, flat stone had to be selected, shaped, and set with precision to maintain the continuity of the pattern across a curved surface. There is a sense of patience in this work, a rejection of the hurried or the temporary. It suggests a society that valued the slow accumulation of effort, where the act of building was a meditative process that spanned generations. And yet, as durable as these stone patterns are, they are only a shadow of the vibrant artistry that once filled these spaces. Down in the sheltered valleys and within the dry, protected microclimates of the cliffside tombs, a more delicate history has been preserved. The Chachapoya were masters of the textile arts, working with the fine, soft wool of the camelids, the llamas and alpacas that grazed on the high pajonal grasses. In the humid air of the jungle, organic materials usually vanish within a few decades, reclaimed by the soil and the moss. But the Chachapoya possessed a profound understanding of their environment. By placing their honored dead in limestone niches tucked high under overhanging cliffs, they created a natural laboratory for preservation. The air in these tombs remains remarkably dry, shielded from the torrential rains by the natural eaves of the mountain. When archaeologists first peered into these sacred spaces, they found more than just bone and dust. They found bundles wrapped in exquisite fabrics that had retained their integrity for over 600 years. These textiles are a riot of earth tones and deep vegetal dyes, ochres, madders, and indigos that have resisted the fading touch of time. The weaving is incredibly fine, sometimes reaching a thread count that rivals modern industrial machinery. The patterns found on these cloths often mirror the geometric friezes of the stone walls, suggesting a unified aesthetic that governed every aspect of their lives, from the clothes they wore to the houses they inhabited. It is a strange and beautiful thought. that a person might walk through a city where the very walls were dressed in the same patterns as their own tunic, creating a seamless harmony between the individual and the architecture. Meanwhile, the pottery of the Chachapoya offers another window into their distinct cultural identity. In the early periods of their history, long before the shadow of the Inca fell across the northern highlands, their ceramic style was remarkably independent. It lacks the rigid imperial standardization of the southern empires. Instead, Chachapoya pottery is often bold and functional, with globular vessels and wide-mouthed jars decorated with incised lines or painted with simple, expressive strokes. There is a raw, tactile quality to these objects. They feel as though they were shaped by hands that were intimately familiar with the clay of the riverbeds. As we examine these vessels, we notice a fascinating absence. In those early layers of the earth, what archaeologists call the stratigraphy, or the chronological layering of soil and artifacts, there is almost no sign of outside influence. For centuries, the Chachapoya developed their artistic voice in a state of splendid isolation, or perhaps a deliberate rejection of the styles of their neighbors. While the Wari and the Tiwanaku empires were spreading their iconography across much of the Andes, the people of the clouds remained steadfast in their own traditions. Their art was a reflection of the vertical world they inhabited, a world of steep descents and sudden ascents, where the horizon was always a jagged line of stone. The preservation of these perishable items, the wooden carvings, the feathered headdresses, and the woven baskets, allows us to bridge the gap between the cold stone ruins and the living, breathing people who once called them home. In the dry silence of the cliff tombs, researchers have recovered wooden statues known as Purun Mahus, which stood as guardians over the sarcophagi. These figures, carved from hardy wood and often painted, have survived the centuries with their features intact. They stare out across the valleys with wide, haunting eyes, their expressions a mixture of stoicism and eternal watchfulness. There is something deeply moving about the survival of these fragile things. A basket woven from mountain grasses, still holding the remains of a meal prepared centuries ago. A leather pouch containing small stones or medicinal herbs, a child's tunic carefully mended at the shoulder. These are the artifacts of the everyday, the small threads that connect us to the human experience of the past. They remind us that the Chachapoya were not just legendary warriors or mysterious builders of cloud fortresses. They were people who appreciated the texture of a well-made cloth and the balance of a perfectly fired bowl. As the years passed and the climate shifted, these artifacts remained locked in their stone galleries, protected by the very mountains that made life so challenging. The use of radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic matter, has revealed that some of these textiles and wooden offerings date back much further than previously thought, pushing the origins of Chachapoya artistry deep into the first millennium. It suggests a long, slow ripening of culture, a steady refinement of skill that occurred far away from the eyes of the rest of the world. We are forced to wonder what else remains hidden in the folds of the mountains. For every tomb that has been studied, there are likely dozens more, obscured by vines or tucked into crevices that no human foot has touched in 500 years. The artistry of the Chachapoya is a puzzle with many missing pieces, yet the fragments we possess are enough to tell a story of immense sophistication. It is a story told in the language of geometry and fibre, written on the skins of the cliffs and in the weave of the wool. As we linger in this high-altitude gallery, we begin to realize that for the Chachapoya, art was not something to be hung on a wall or placed on a pedestal. It was woven into the fabric of existence. It was the way a house was built, the way a body was prepared for the journey beyond, and the way a story was told without words. The intricate patterns they left behind are like a heartbeat, faint but steady, pulsing through the white silence of the Andes, inviting us to listen, to observe, and to remember a world that was crafted with as much love as it was with stone. The clouds may continue to drift through the empty doorways of Kuelap, but the genius of the people who built it remains etched in every line and every thread, waiting for the light of a new day to reveal its secrets once again. A single grain of purple maize, held in the palm of a weathered hand, carries within its hard shell a genetic memory that spans 1,000 years. It is a quiet continuity, a bridge made of starch and soil that connects the modern inhabitants of the Amazonas region to the architects of the clouds. While the great circular citadels may sit in silent ruin, the lifeblood of the Chachapoya did not simply vanish into the mist of the 16th century. It flowed downward from the high rocky ridges into the sheltered valleys, settling into the rhythms of the mountain villages that still cling to the emerald slopes today. In the town of Lemebamba and in the small remote hamlets that dot the Utcubamba Valley, the faces of the people reflect a history that is far more complex than the standard accounts of conquest and collapse would suggest. The mystery of the blue-eyed kings is not merely a ghost story or a legend for travelers, but a living presence. Visitors to these high-altitude communities often remark on the striking physical features of the locals: the occasional flash of light-colored eyes, the fair skin that reddens under the Andean sun, and the tall stature that seems to echo the descriptions recorded by the first Spanish chroniclers. These are the physical echoes of a population that was once described as the most beautiful and light-skinned in all the Americas. Yet, for the people who live here, these traits are not a curiosity of archaeology, but a simple fact of ancestry. They are the keepers of a lineage that survived the dark winters of the Inca expansion and the subsequent arrival of the smallpox-bearing Europeans. They represent the endurance of a culture that refused to be erased, even when its cities were reclaimed by the creeping vines and the damp breath of the jungle. As the years passed, the Chachapoya descendants did not abandon the wisdom of their ancestors. They continued to cultivate the same terraces that had been carved into the mountainsides centuries before, using techniques that prioritize the delicate balance of the cloud-forest ecosystem. Even now, one can observe the persistence of traditional agricultural methods, the careful management of water, the rotation of crops that have been adapted over millennia to thrive in the thin, oxygen-poor air. They grow varieties of tubers and grains that are found nowhere else on Earth, biological treasures that have been passed down from mother to daughter, from father to son, through dozens of generations. This is a form of living stratigraphy, where the layers of time are not found in the dirt, but in the diversity of the seeds and the calloused hands that plant them. The Peruvian government, recognizing the fragile beauty of this heritage, has begun to weave a new narrative for the region. There is a growing movement towards sustainable tourism, a slow and careful opening of the gates that seeks to protect the ruins while providing a future for the modern Chachapoya. It is a delicate dance between preservation and progress. The installation of the cable car system to Kuelap was a significant milestone, allowing the world to witness the grandeur of the stone city without the destructive impact of heavy road construction. But beyond the stone walls, the focus is shifting toward conservation, protecting the vast tracts of primary cloud forest that serve as the lungs of the Andes. These forests are not just scenery. They are the sacred groves where the Chachapoya once buried their dead in high sarcophagi, and they remain the home of the yellow-tailed woolly monkey and the spectacled bear. By protecting the land, the descendants are protecting the very essence of their identity, ensuring that the spirits of the mountains have a place to dwell. Meanwhile, the cold analytical gaze of modern science is beginning to provide answers that the chronicles could only hint at. In recent years, ongoing DNA projects have sought to map the ancestry of the Amazonas region with a precision that was previously impossible. geneticists take small samples from the local population, looking for the markers of deep time, the molecular signatures that have traveled through the centuries. These studies are beginning to reveal a fascinating tapestry. While there is, of course, a significant mixture of Spanish and broader Andean DNA, there remains a distinct genetic cluster that is unique to this specific corridor of the mountains. It is a signature that predates the Inca, a biological thumbprint of the original cloud people. Some of these genetic investigations have looked for evidence of transoceanic contact, testing the fringe theories that the Chachapoya might have had ancient European or Levantine origins. While mainstream science remains cautious, favoring the idea that their unique appearance was a result of long-term isolation and perhaps a founder effect within a small, specific population, the data continues to offer surprises. The DNA tells a story of a people who were fiercely independent, showing very little genetic overlap with the coastal groups or the peoples of the southern highlands until much later in their history. They were a world unto themselves, a biological island in a sea of clouds. Every sample processed in a laboratory is a step toward understanding how these people lived, how they moved, and how they managed to maintain such a distinct identity in the face of the massive, homogenizing empires that surrounded them. The landscape itself seems to participate in this act of remembering. In the quiet hours of the morning, when the fog sits heavy in the valleys, the modern villages look remarkably like the ancient settlements. The smoke from wood-fired hearths rises in thin, blue ribbons, blending with the mist just as it did 1,000 years ago. The language of the region, though now predominantly Spanish, still carries the echoes of the lost Chachapoya tongue in its place names and its local idioms. Words like Kuelap, Congon, and Abiseo are phonetic fossils, sounds that were shaped by mouths that have long since turned to dust, yet they are spoken daily by children walking to school or farmers tending to their cattle. There is a profound sense of patience in this part of the world. The people of the Amazonas do not seem hurried by the pace of the modern age. They understand, perhaps better than anyone, that empires are fleeting things, but the mountain remains. They have seen the Inca come and go. They have seen the Spanish crown rise and fall, and they now watch as the modern world turns its curious eyes toward their ancestral homes. Through it all, they have remained the stewards of the heights. The connection to the past is not found in a museum display or a history book, but in the way a roof is thatched, the way a loom is weighted, and the way a story is told by the firelight. As we look upon the modern inhabitants of this rugged terrain, we are reminded that a civilization is more than its monuments. It is a collective memory, a set of values, and a specific way of existing within the natural world. The Chachapoya genius for stoneworking may have reached its zenith in the walls of Kuelap, but their genius for survival is written in the lives of their descendants. The Blue-Eyed Kings may be a romanticized title born of colonial wonder, but the reality of a distinct, resilient, and beautiful people is undeniable. They are the living legacy of the Andes, a testament to the fact that even when a city is abandoned, its spirit finds a way to endure, flowing like a hidden stream beneath the surface of the present, waiting for those who know how to listen to the whispers of the wind. The ongoing research, from the archaeological digs to the mapping of the human genome, serves as a reminder of the limits of our knowledge. We often speak of discovering these places as if they were lost to everyone but ourselves, but to the people of the Amazonas, the Chachapoya were never truly lost. They were simply resting, their stories kept safe in the high places where the air is clear and the silence is absolute. As the DNA projects continue to unfold, we may find that the map of human history is far more intricate than we ever dared to imagine, with threads of connection reaching across distances and eras that defy our current understanding of the ancient world. For now, the mystery remains a gentle presence, a soft light illuminating the faces of those who still call the cloud forest home, ensuring that the legacy of the Chachapoya is not just a matter of stone and bone, but of breath and blood. The damp smell of crushed moss and ancient, cold stone rises from the earth as the mist rolls in once more, swallowing the high ridges of the Utcubamba Valley. It is a silence that feels heavy, layered with the weight of 1,000 years, as if the forest itself is holding its breath to protect the secrets of those who once walked these dizzying heights. We find ourselves returning to the image of the blue-eyed kings, a title that carries the romantic weight of a Victorian explorer's diary, yet one that speaks to a very real and persistent anomaly. Whether these traits were the result of a small, isolated genetic pocket, an early crossing of the great ocean, or simply the poetic exaggeration of Spanish chroniclers like Pedro Chiesa de León, the reality behind the myth is far more grounding. These were not gods or foreign invaders, but a people of the clouds who mastered an environment that would break a lesser spirit. They built their roundhouses on the edge of the abyss, weaving their lives into the verticality of the Andes, and in doing so, they created a culture that refused to be silenced, even by the double conquest of the Inca and the Spanish. The great Fortress of Kuelap stands as the ultimate testament to this resilience, its massive limestone walls rising 60 feet into the air like a crown upon the mountain. As we contemplate its scale, we must consider the sheer human effort required to transport and shape these millions of cubic feet of stone without the use of the wheel or iron tools. It is a monument to collective will, a physical manifestation of a society that valued the high, untouchable places. Even now, as archaeologists brush away the soil and use radiocarbon dating to pin these structures to the timeline of the 14th century, the stones seem to resist such simple categorization. They speak of a deeper time, an era where the boundary between the living and the dead was as thin as the veil of fog that separates the peaks from the sky. Kuelap was not merely a defensive structure, but a sanctuary of memory, a place where the ancestors were kept close, their presence felt in the very foundations of the homes. Our journey has taken us from the sun-drenched valleys where the first seeds were planted, up through the tangled thickets of the cloud forest, and finally to the sheer cliff faces where the sarcophagi of Karagia stand watch. These clay figures, with their oversized heads and enigmatic expressions, have looked out over the valley for centuries, their painted eyes seeing the rise and fall of empires they never joined. They represent the final quietude of the Chachapoya, a refusal to be buried in the dark earth, choosing instead the wind and the light. There is a profound peace in the way they occupy the heights, a sense that they have achieved a permanent state of observation, detached from the frantic pace of the world below. As the years passed and the jungle reclaimed the stone stairways, the Chachapoya passed from history into legend, leaving behind only these silent sentinels to tell their story. The mystery of their origins, the whispers of fair skin and tall statures, continues to flicker in the periphery of our understanding like a guttering candle in a vast, dark hall. Science may eventually provide a map of their DNA, tracing the migration patterns of their ancestors back to the edges of the Amazon or perhaps further afield. But data alone cannot capture the essence of a people. The true legacy of the Chachapoya lies in the feeling one gets when standing amidst the ruins of a circular home, looking out at a horizon that seems to go on forever. It is the realization that human history is not a straight line of progress, but a complex tapestry of cultures that bloom and fade in the hidden corners of the world. We are often led to believe that the past is a closed book, its chapters neatly titled and accounted for, yet the cloud forest reminds us that much of our story remains unwritten, hidden beneath layers of lichen and time. As we linger in this high, thin air, the questions we began with seem to change their shape. It matters less, perhaps, whether a stray ship from a distant land once touched the coast, and more that a society thrived here in total harmony with the rugged verticality of the earth. The blue-eyed kings are a symbol of our own desire for the extraordinary, a reflection of our hope that the world is still full of wonders that defy explanation. And yet, the reality of the Chachapoya, their engineering, their art, their fierce independence, is wonder enough. They were the masters of the mist, the architects of the impossible, carving a civilization out of the very clouds. Their story is a reminder that even when a culture is conquered, even when its language is lost and its cities are reclaimed by the trees, something of its spirit remains. It lingers in the shape of a doorway, the curve of a stone wall, and the resilience of the descendants who still walk these mountain paths. The silence of the cloud forest is not an empty thing. It is a full, vibrant quiet, thick with the echoes of those who came before. As the light fades and the stars begin to pierce through the canopy, the ancient stones of Kuelap seem to glow with a soft, borrowed radiance. We are merely visitors here, passing through a landscape that belongs to the ages, a place where the younger Dryas and the modern era feel like 2 points on the same continuous circle. The secrets of the Chachapoya are safe, held in the cold grip of the high Andes and the eternal embrace of the mist. They do not demand to be solved, they only ask to be remembered. And so, we leave the peaks behind, descending slowly through the layers of green and grey, carrying with us the weight of these forgotten ages. The journey from the tombs to the peaks has been a long one, a slow meditation on the limits of what we can truly know about the souls who inhabited the deep past. As the sound of the wind dies down and the warmth of the lower valleys rises to meet us, the image of the white-skinned warriors and their stone fortresses begins to blur, becoming part of the dreamscape of the Andes. The mist closes in behind us, sealing the path, ensuring that the Chachapoya remain exactly where they belong, suspended between the earth and the heavens, forever watching, forever silent. In the vast, unfolding story of our world, they are a quiet chapter, written in stone and bone, waiting for the wind to turn another page. For now, the mountain sleeps, and the secrets it holds remain undisturbed, tucked away in the shadows of the great walls, beneath the watchful eyes of the clay kings. The journey ends not with a final answer, but with a deeper appreciation for the mystery itself, a recognition that some things are meant to remain hidden, protected by the clouds and the passage of time. The mountain remains. The stone remains. And in the heart of the forest, the legacy of the Chachapoya breathes on, a soft, steady pulse in the darkness of the ancient world.